Tonight we slip back nearly 2,000 years, into streets that smell of ash, olives, and most importantly, bread. You stand in the middle of a Roman forum, surrounded by chatter, haggling, and the creak of wooden carts. The air is hazy with dust, but every other corner seems to draw you toward the same thing, the golden glow of fresh loaves stacked high, their crusts crackling in the sunlight. It's warm, inviting, and strangely comforting, until you remember there's no fridge, no Ziploc bags, not even a cupboard that can keep the bugs out. Bread is life here, but keeping it fresh? That's a battle Rome never really won. If you had to survive on these loaves without a freezer or preservatives, well, you probably wouldn't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge past a bakery where a donkey endlessly turns a millstone, grinding grain into flour. The baker, arms white with dust, shouts for help as his apprentice struggles to shovel loaves from a blazing clay oven. Children line up outside clutching coins, waiting for their family's share of bread, which, let's be honest, often mattered more than wine or meat. Rome had plenty of foods, but bread wasn't just food, it was a symbol. Politicians knew it too, handing out loaves during festivals to keep the crowds happy. Historians still argue whether bread and circuses was more about genuine generosity or just clever distraction, but either way, the city's pulse beat to the rhythm of ovens. You notice that every household depends on this rhythm. Some families bake at home, others buy from professional bakeries. Bread is so central that Romans even divided society by the kind of loaf you could afford. The rich boasted about their soft, fine white loaves, while the poor made do with darker, coarse ones speckled with husks. And yet, no matter your status, the same problem stalked every table. Yesterday's loaf turns hard, unchewable, sometimes speckled with mold that creeps like green lace. Here's the quirky part: some Romans actually preferred yesterday's bread, claiming the firm chew was easier on the stomach. Imagine telling your family today, "Don't throw that stale baguette away, it's medicinal." You might not get invited to dinner again, but in Rome, that belief lingered. Everywhere you walk, bread hovers in conversations, in rituals, in jokes. There's even graffiti scratched on walls mocking bakers for shortchanging customers, or boasting about a loaf's fluffiness. The whole city seems to orbit around dough, fire, and crust. And yet, the anxiety about keeping bread edible stretches across every block. Without fresh loaves, soldiers might riot, families might go hungry, and bakers might lose their customers to competitors promising longer-lasting loaves. You stop at a stall where vendors shout over each other, waving round loaves that look suspiciously like the ones found carbonized in Pompeii, scored into neat wedges so families could divide them evenly. These loaves, soft in the morning, would already be stiff by evening. Some folks dunked them into wine or olive oil, soaking away the hardness, but that was only a stopgap. You can't help but imagine the rhythm of daily life shaped around this ticking clock of staleness. Wake up, buy or bake bread, rush to eat it while it's still tender, then worry about what's left over tomorrow. Unlike us, who throw bread into a freezer or bread box, Romans built entire habits and traditions just to manage freshness. And the further you look, the more inventive and sometimes desperate these methods become. Bread in Roman life wasn't just a meal, it was infrastructure, politics, superstition, and survival. Without reliable bread, society cracked just as quickly as a stale crust. And as you keep walking deeper into the alleys, you begin to notice all the small, ingenious tricks Romans tried, from the way they stored grain to the odd things they mixed into their dough, all in the hope that tomorrow's loaf wouldn't already be ruined. One mainstream fact anchors your thoughts: grain shipments fed Rome itself. Ships hauled wheat from Egypt across the Mediterranean, because without it, the city starved. The whole empire's stability relied on a steady river of grain and bread. But just as importantly, the quality of that bread determined how happy, or angry, the people felt. Meanwhile, a fringe tidbit reaches your ear. Some Romans whispered that bread blessed by the household gods stayed fresher longer. Whether it actually did or whether the family simply convinced themselves of it, who knows? Still, loaves were sometimes set before small shrines in kitchens, hoping divine eyes might keep mold at bay. Your gaze falls on a boy munching happily on his bread, crumbs trailing down his tunic. He doesn't care about preservation, about mold, about the politics of grain. He's just enjoying the simple taste of something warm, soft, and filling. And maybe that's the heart of it. The Romans, despite all their clever tricks and anxieties, just wanted their bread to last long enough for tomorrow's hunger. You lean back against a sun-warmed wall, listening to the chatter, the donkeys, the hiss of ovens, and the crunch of crust under eager teeth. The stage is set. You've seen how central bread is to every Roman. And soon, as you wander into the deeper workings of this empire, you'll see just how far they went to keep that bread from turning into nothing more than a rock-hard brick. You leave the crowded bakery streets behind and wander toward the edge of the city, where the air smells less of roasted crust and more of dust and straw. Here stand the hulking shapes of Roman horia, granaries, massive storehouses that look more like fortresses than barns. If bread is the heartbeat of Rome, then these are its lungs, holding the breath of grain that keeps the whole empire alive. You step inside one of these stone warehouses, and the shift is immediate, cool, dim, and echoing, with dust motes dancing in shafts of light. The Romans knew that bread began to die the moment the grain spoiled, so they became obsessed with keeping wheat fresh, dry, and bug-free. You notice raised floors, cleverly set on stone piers so air could circulate beneath. It's the ancient equivalent of ventilation fans, except here it's just dry air sneaking under planks. Without this trick, mold crept in, rats threw nightly feasts, and entire shipments could rot before they ever touched a millstone. Historians still argue whether these design features were standardized empire-wide or just improvised region by region. Some scholars point to uniform remains of storage jars and vaults, while others insist local farmers had their own quirky hacks. Either way, you can see the anxiety in every corner. Piles of grain were turned over by hand to keep them from heating up, a sweaty, back-breaking job that feels like babysitting an angry sand dune. And the enemies? Oh, they were tiny and relentless. Insects loved Roman granaries. Weevils, beetles, and moths drilled their way into kernels, chewing holes that ruined whole sacks. One quirky tidbit surfaces here. Some Romans believed that tossing laurel leaves into the piles drove the bugs away. Did it work? Probably about as well as putting lavender in your sock drawer keeps out hungry mice, but hey, it smelled nice, and it gave the illusion of control. You imagine farmers trudging in with carts heaped high after harvest, only to pray their contribution survived the winter. A bad infestation could mean hunger for thousands, or worse, angry mobs demanding free bread at the forum. Roman writers even joked about bread riots, but the danger was real. And here's the kicker, grain wasn't just food. It was currency, politics, and social control. The state kept a careful watch on its storage and distribution. An emperor who failed to secure grain shipments from Egypt might find his rule crumbling faster than yesterday's loaf. So, yes, every stone in these granaries carried the weight of empire. You wander deeper between towering clay jars called dolia, some as tall as you, mouths sealed with wax or cloth. Inside, wheat slumbers in the dark. People believed sealing off the top slowed decay, though you know air still sneaks in. Someone once suggested mixing ash into the grain to deter pests, because nothing says bon appetit like finding a mouthful of soot in your porridge. And yet, in desperation, they tried it. Even the soldiers guarding these granaries understood the stakes. They didn't just protect treasure, they guarded tomorrow's bread. If looters broke in, They weren't stealing sacks of grain, they were stealing a city's heartbeat. You brush your fingers across a rough wall, feeling how thick and cool the masonry stays. Romans built these warehouses with heat in mind, battling the Mediterranean sun. And though they lacked thermometers or humidity sensors, their intuition was spot on. Cooler air, drier walls, fewer bugs. You can almost picture a farmer sighing with relief as his harvest disappears behind these heavy doors, trusting stone and Roman ingenuity to stretch the life of his wheat. But let's be honest, no amount of clever building stopped the inevitable. Grain still spoiled. Insects still had a party. Rats gnawed, people fretted, and bakers cursed when flour smelled off. That's why bread in Rome was never really fresh the way you know it today. It was more like a countdown timer, ticking from the moment wheat was cut in the fields. And yet, somehow, the city kept going. You hear the shuffle of feet, voices echoing in the vaults, the scrape of shovels turning grain. Somewhere, a child sneaks a handful of kernels, chewing on them raw because even half-spoiled wheat fills a belly. You catch yourself smiling at the thought, children today sneak cookies, Roman kids sneak handfuls of grain dust. Not quite the same sugar rush. You step back into the light, squinting as the sun glares off the tiled roofs. The granaries stay behind you, silent sentinels holding the empire's lifeblood. You can still smell the faint bitterness of wheat, feel the scratch of chaff in your nose. Bread begins here, in the shadows of these warehouses, in the anxious hands of farmers and officials who know a bad harvest or a careless mouse could topple more than a dinner table, it could topple emperors. So when you next bite into a slice of bread, think of the Romans pacing their granaries, weighing sacks, whispering charms about laurel leaves, and fighting off armies of bugs the size of rice grains. To them, every kernel mattered, because without it, tomorrow's loaf might never appear on the table. You leave the granaries behind, brushing grain dust from your tunic, and follow the creak of wooden carts toward the mills. The sound grows louder, thump, grind, groan, like an ancient heartbeat echoing across the city. Here, flour is born, and with it comes an entirely new challenge: how to keep it fresh before it even becomes bread. You duck into a courtyard where donkeys circle endlessly, turning massive millstones. Their hooves clop against the worn stones, tails swishing lazily, while the air hums with flour dust so thick you almost choke. Your sandals crunch over spilled powder that looks deceptively soft, but clings to your skin with sticky insistence. And you realize something: flour, unlike whole grain, is far more fragile. The moment wheat is ground, the oils inside the kernels begin to spoil, giving off a sour taste. It's like cutting open an avocado, you know you have minutes before it starts turning brown. Romans figured this out quickly. Freshly milled flour made sweet, light loaves. But let it sit for too long. You'd get rancid bread that smelled like wet dog. Historians still argue whether Roman bakers sold flour directly to families or jealously guarded it in their shops, doling out just enough for the day's bake. Some evidence suggests people deliberately avoided storing flour at home because it spoiled too quickly, preferring instead to line up at mills every morning. Imagine if you had to visit a coffee grinder daily just to keep your morning cup from tasting like socks. And here's your quirky tidbit: some Romans believed you could revive old flour by mixing it with fresh herbs or even milk. In theory, the additives masked the rancid tang. In practice, it was like spraying perfume over spoiled milk, not fooling anyone. Still, in a world where throwing food away meant hunger, these hacks gave families hope. You step closer to one of the donkey-powered mills, and the baker wipes sweat from his brow, gesturing for you to taste a pinch of fresh flour. It's warm, almost nutty, with the faint sweetness of grain. He warns you, though, not to leave it sitting in the sun. Flour stored in sacks could clump, go moldy, or worse, harbor worms. That's why some bakers stored their flour in sealed clay jars, hoping to slow the inevitable. Romans didn't have chemical preservatives, but they understood environment mattered. Keep flour dry and shaded, it lasted a bit longer. Expose it to moisture, and you'd get a bubbling, fermenting mess. The irony. Sometimes that accident became useful. Bakers might stumble across naturally fermenting flour-water mixtures and turn them into sourdough starters, wild yeast experiments that gave bread a tangy resilience. You wander outside again, noticing a line of hand mills along the street. Not everyone could afford donkey-powered grinders, so families often had slaves or children grind grain manually, cranking heavy stones back and forth. The result was coarse flour full of husks, but at least it could be baked the same day. Those husks also acted like natural preservatives, extending the loaf's life just a little longer, though your teeth paid the price with every gritty bite. There's a simple rhythm here: grain into flour, flour into dough, dough into bread, all within a single day if possible. Delay, and freshness slips away. You can almost hear mothers scolding children to hurry back from the mill before the flour goes bad, as though the powder itself might start sulking in the jar. You pause at a shady corner where scholars debate. One insists Romans sifted their flour through fine cloths to keep it clean and prolong its life. Another scoffs, saying most families couldn't waste that much effort, especially when even spoiled flour could be disguised in porridge. And that's where you smile, because in every era, people argue about food safety, even when the science is hazy. Still, the stakes were higher in Rome. Bad flour didn't just mean disappointing bread, it meant illness. Moldy grains carried toxins that could sicken entire households. Ancient writers warned about black bread made from spoiled flour, describing its bitter taste and unsettling effects. You imagine a family, desperate and hungry, still chewing through a loaf they knew was risky, because hunger was always riskier. You continue down the street, your sandals leaving floury prints behind. Children chase each other, faces powdered white from playing too close to the mills. A baker curses as a sack bursts, sending clouds of flour swirling like smoke. Everyone coughs, sneezes, laughs, and gets on with it. This is Rome: flour dust in the lungs, stale loaves on the horizon, but bread on the table tonight. And in the back of your mind, you realize something. Freshness here isn't just about storage. It's about speed, timing, vigilance. The Romans lived in a daily sprint against spoilage, grinding and baking with the clock always ticking. The moment wheat was cracked, the race began. So you leave the mills behind, ears ringing with the groan of stones, throat dry with flour, and you can't help but wonder, if flour was already fragile, what tricks did bakers use once it was mixed into dough? Because surely, with the right additives and rituals, they must have tried to squeeze just a little more life out of each loaf. You step into a side street where the smell of yeast, honey, and something sharply acidic hangs in the air. The mills have handed their flour over, and now it's in the baker's hands, being transformed into dough. And here, you realize, is where Romans really began to experiment. They didn't just mix flour, water, and salt, they reached for all kinds of additives, hoping to coax their loaves into lasting a little longer than nature intended. The first thing you notice is a baker drizzling vinegar into a bowl of bubbling dough. He stirs it with quick, practiced movements, explaining that the acidity keeps mold at bay and makes the bread last longer. You tear off a piece once it's baked, tart, chewy, strangely refreshing, though definitely not what you'd call comfort bread. Historians still argue whether vinegar was added mostly for preservation or just for flavor, but either way, the trick lingered in Roman kitchens. Next door, another baker is working with honey. He spoons it into the mixture, sticky threads glinting in the light. Honey, as you know, has natural preservative qualities, it resists bacteria, and it locks in moisture. The resulting loaf is sweeter, denser, and far less likely to dry out overnight. The downside? It costs more, which means only wealthier families could regularly afford this trick. For most people, honey bread was a festival treat, not a daily staple. Still, the rumor that honey kept bread young gave it a special aura. And then there are the odd powders. You peer into a small jar a baker produces proudly, it's ground marble dust. Yes, marble. Apparently, some bakers experimented with mineral additives to strengthen texture and slow spoilage. Quirky? Absolutely. Delicious? Probably not. You imagine biting into a loaf that crunches faintly, like chewing on a sandcastle. Yet, in desperate times, people tried whatever they could. One quirky tidbit you overhear from an apprentice makes you raise your eyebrows. Some believed adding a splash of seawater instead of fresh water gave bread a longer shelf life. The salt certainly would have slowed bacterial growth, but it also gave the bread a briny, almost fishy taste. Maybe it was an acquired taste, like anchovy pizza, but worse. Still, amidst these experiments, one fact stands clear: Romans were pioneers of the sourdough method. By leaving dough to ferment naturally, they discovered the acidity created by lactic bacteria slowed staleness. That's right, the tangy sourdough you might eat today isn't just hipster food, it's a survival tactic that's thousands of years old. You picture a Roman baker, nose wrinkling as dough sits overnight, then breaking into a grin the next morning when the loaf not only rises but also resists going stale too quickly. You linger in the bakery, listening to the slap of dough on tables, the chatter of apprentices kneading with flour-caked hands. Every loaf here carries not just the flavor of grain but the experiments of generations. One baker insists that sprinkling fennel seeds on top keeps mold away. Another swears by mixing in a dash of wine, arguing the alcohol purifies the dough. Historians still argue whether these were genuine preservation attempts or just flavor embellishments that accidentally helped, but either way, the trial-and-error culture of Roman baking is alive around you. There's humor in it too. You overhear a joke scratched on the wall: "This bread lasts longer than my mother-in-law's patience." You chuckle, realizing that even then, people poked fun at the fragility of their food. You step outside for a breath of fresh air, only to find a street vendor reheating yesterday's experimental loaves over coals, trying to mask the staleness. The smell of warm crust fools your senses, but biting into the loaf reveals the truth: it's chewy, dense, with a faint tang of vinegar. Still edible, yes, and better than going hungry. At this moment, you reflect: Romans weren't just baking, they were waging a daily war against time. Additives were their weapons. Some worked, some didn't, but all reveal the same determination: bread must last. And maybe that's what fascinates you most. Here, in this ancient city, you see the same instinct people have today: stretch food as far as possible, find tricks, invent hacks, and convince yourself it tastes fine even when it's past its prime. The Romans didn't have preservatives in shiny plastic wrappers, but they had vinegar, honey, herbs, seawater, and stubborn optimism. As you wander away, the sounds of kneading fade behind you, replaced by the distant roar of ovens. Ahead lies another frontier in this battle for freshness: the way heat itself shaped bread into loaves with crusts like armor, meant to lock in life for just a little longer. You follow the smoky air until it grows hotter, thicker, until you're standing before a bakery oven that glows like the heart of a volcano. The dome-shaped clay structure radiates waves of heat, and a baker, his tunic darkened with sweat, maneuvers a long wooden paddle with the ease of a swordsman. The loaves he slides inside are squat and round, the kind you've already seen etched in Pompeii's ashes, each one marked with dividing grooves like pizza slices waiting to be pulled apart. Here you notice something clever: these loaves don't just taste good fresh, they're engineered to last, at least a little. Romans understood, maybe by accident at first, that the crust is more than just a tasty exterior. The harder and thicker the crust, the better it protected the crumb inside from drying out or molding. Each loaf emerging from this blazing oven is essentially wearing armor. You crouch closer and hear the crackle, like tiny applause from the bread itself. The outer shell forms quickly, sealing in moisture. Tomorrow, that crust will be tougher, but the inside will still be edible. The baker grins knowingly as he wraps a finished loaf on the counter. The hollow thud is proof of both freshness and longevity. Historians still argue whether Roman bakers intentionally aimed for this crust armor or if it was simply a byproduct of their oven design. After all, those domed clay ovens retained heat so fiercely that any loaf would naturally develop a strong shell. Yet, the consistency of Roman bread shapes suggests more than accident. It suggests planning, tradition, maybe even competition to see who could bake loaves that endured the longest march from oven to table. Your quirky tidbit arrives in the form of a whispered aside from a flour-dusted apprentice. Some bakers believed spitting into the oven before sliding in the bread gave it extra life. Gross. Absolutely. Superstitious? Definitely. But you can't deny the ritual added a sense of control in a game where freshness was constantly slipping through their fingers. The oven itself is mesmerizing. The heat hits your face in blasts, and the smell is intoxicating: roasted grain, faint sweetness, a smoky undertone from the firewood. You imagine standing guard over loaves like these, because for many families, the oven wasn't just for bread. It was for preservation. Consider this: day-old bread could be revived by placing it briefly back into the oven, reheating it until the crust crisped and the crumbs softened slightly. It wasn't truly fresh, but it tricked the senses. Street vendors took advantage of this, carrying portable braziers where they toasted slices of yesterday's loaves to fool passers-by into thinking they were buying something fresh. And the ovens weren't small. Some could churn out hundreds of loaves daily, their curved ceilings trapping heat for hours. You picture the rhythm: firewood stacked, coals spread, loaves shoved in, loaves pulled out, stacks forming by the door. Bakers wiped sweat from their brows as customers crowded, each loaf a ticking clock of freshness. One mainstream fact catches your attention: Roman bread was often scored with deep cuts before baking, dividing it into portions. Not only did this make sharing easier, but the grooves also hardened first, helping hold the loaf's shape and perhaps slowing how quickly the inside went stale. It's like packaging design hidden within the food itself. You lean against the wall, fanning your face, and imagine being a soldier receiving one of these loaves before a march. The crust, thick as leather, might not taste delightful on day 3, but it would still be edible. Soaked in wine or stew, it transformed from rock-hard to nourishing. It was strategy baked right into the loaf. And then comes the human side. A child waits outside the bakery, clutching a coin, nose twitching with anticipation. For him, it's not about crust armor or shelf life, it's about biting into something warm and soft while it lasts. Tomorrow, he'll gnaw on the hard edges, dunk it in broth, and accept it. Romans grew up with this rhythm, their palates tuned not just to fresh but to every stage of bread's decline. A faint laugh escapes you at the thought: today we toss bread the moment it hardens, but in Rome, they embraced it, repurposed it, engineered it. Bread had stages, like wine or cheese, and the oven was the stage manager, dictating how long the show could go on. The baker pulls out another round, crust gleaming like bronze in the firelight. He sets it on the counter, and steam curls upward, fragrant and fleeting. You realize the Romans had no preservatives, no plastic bags, no freezers, but they did have fire. And with fire, they built loaves that carried them through days, through marches, through hunger. You step back into the cooler street, face flushed, and glance once more at the smoking dome. Ahead, the road curves toward the military camp. And you can almost hear the tramp of sandals, the shouts of legionaries, and the crunch of bread packed not for flavor but for endurance. You hear it before you see it: the steady, pounding rhythm of marching feet, the metallic jingle of armor, the guttural chants of men on the move. A Roman legion is passing, and as you fall in step along the dusty road, you quickly notice something: every soldier carries bread. Not fluffy, oven-fresh rounds, but hard, dense loaves designed to survive weeks of marching across strange lands. This is where bread transforms from comfort food into survival rations. The loaves soldiers carry aren't meant to delight the senses, they're meant to endure. You watch a centurion pull out what looks suspiciously like a brick, knock it against his shield, and laugh. The sound is closer to wood than bread. And yet, when he dunks it into a leather cup of watered wine, the crust softens, and he chews with satisfaction. Here lies a mainstream fact. The Roman army issued bread or grain as a core part of the ration, alongside dried meat, vinegar, the famous posca, and sometimes cheese. Bread was the portable stomach filler, compact and calorie-dense. Historians still argue whether soldiers baked their own bread in makeshift field ovens or received pre-baked loaves from military suppliers. Some evidence shows they carried flour and small hand mills, grinding and baking on the march. Others believe state bakeries produced hardtack-like loaves designed to last, much like the sea biscuits sailors gnawed centuries later. And here's your quirky tidbit: Roman soldiers sometimes joked that their loaves were tougher than their sandals. After all, leather straps frayed quickly in the mud, but the bread was still hanging in there. Some even carved names or little symbols into their loaves before baking, partly for fun, partly to avoid mix-ups in camp. Imagine marking your ration like a child labeling lunch Tupperware, except here it's Marcus's bread, hands off. You trudge beside a group of legionaries, watching as they pull chunks of stale loaf from their packs. The sun beats down, sweat drips, and yet the bread holds its own, unchanged by heat or time. This wasn't by accident. Bakers hardened these loaves intentionally, making them low in moisture so mold couldn't easily creep in. Think of it as the ancient prototype of military rations: bland, bulletproof, and almost eternal. The ritual of softening becomes second nature. A soldier breaks his loaf into bits, tosses them into boiling broth, and waits until they dissolve into a thick, porridge-like mush. Suddenly, the inedible brick transforms into fuel for another march. Bread wasn't just bread, it was the foundation for stews, soups, and improvised meals. Flexibility made it invaluable, because on campaign, freshness wasn't a luxury, it was survival. But not everyone was happy. Complaints about the monotony of rations appear in Roman writings. One soldier supposedly quipped that he could swing his loaf at the enemy and do more damage than with a sword. You grin at the thought. Imagine generals ordering bread barrages instead of catapults. Yet, behind the jokes lies an important truth. Rome's military success depended on dependable food. Bread had to last through mud, rain, heat, and weeks of marching. Without it, morale crumbled. Bread wasn't just calories, it was reassurance, something familiar to chew on while staring down foreign battlefields. You pause at a campfire where soldiers sit cross-legged, loaves piled beside them. They talk of home, of mothers' kitchens, of soft white bread they'll never taste out here. The contrast is clear: bread in camp is fuel, bread at home is love. Both matter, but in different ways. A historian's debate filters into your mind. Some argue the army's reliance on durable bread was what allowed Rome to conquer such vast distances. Without portable food, campaigns would have stalled. Others counter that wine and dried meats were equally crucial. Still, when you look at these men, everyone clutching his loaf, you feel the truth. Bread was the marching song of empire. As dusk falls, you see a soldier carefully wrapping his remaining loaf in cloth before tucking it under his shield. It's not glamorous, not delicious, but it's his lifeline. You realize this is where the Roman obsession with preservation meets its harshest test. On the march, with no ovens in sight and no choice but to make bread last, no matter how hard, no matter how tasteless. You grin at the thought. Modern campers complain when their granola bars get a little crumbly. A Roman legionary would have gladly swapped for anything softer than a paving stone. Still, these loaves carried them across continents, through battles, and into history. The road stretches ahead, and the smell of herbs drifts faintly from a nearby village. Bread hardened for soldiers was one thing. But what about the civilians who experimented with rosemary, smoke, and salt to keep their loaves alive at home? You turn toward the scent, ready to see how the Romans spiced their battle against staleness. You leave the clatter of the marching camp behind and follow that drifting scent of herbs. The air grows sweeter, touched with smoke, until you find yourself standing at the back of a modest Roman kitchen. A woman is scattering sprigs of rosemary across a table, rubbing them into small loaves of dough before sliding them into a waiting oven. The aroma that hits you is rich, green, and slightly piney. And here you realize you're watching another Roman strategy for fighting the slow creep of staleness. Herbs, salt, and smoke, these were the empire's natural preservatives. Romans may not have known about microbes, but they knew certain flavors and treatments seemed to keep loaves edible longer. You watch the woman pull out a finished rosemary loaf, its crust glistening slightly where oil has been brushed across it. She explains that the oil not only adds flavor but also seals in moisture. Bite into it tomorrow, and while it might be chewier, it won't yet crumble into dust. A mainstream fact drifts to mind here. Roman soldiers and civilians alike salted much of their food, not just meat and fish, but bread as well. Salt slowed spoilage and toughened the crumb, extending its life by at least a day or two. In a world without plastic wrap, even a single day was worth celebrating. But the real experiment you catch tonight involves smoke. Step into a small storage room, and you find loaves stacked on shelves above a smoldering brazier. The baker explains, proudly, that the smoke infuses the bread, driving away insects and slowing mold. You cough at the acrid tang in your throat, but he beams as though unveiling the future of food preservation. Historians still argue whether this was common practice or just a fringe method used by certain regions. Some archaeologists point to smoky residues on bakery walls, while others suggest these are simply traces of cooking fires. Whatever the truth, the idea of smoked bread, like smoked cheese or fish, isn't far-fetched at all. And then comes your quirky tidbit. Some Romans believed rubbing garlic directly onto the crust gave bread protective powers against rot. Did it work? Maybe the sulfur compounds offered a tiny boost, but mostly it probably left you with the world's most pungent sandwich. Still, you can't help but smile. Today people claim garlic wards off vampires. Back then, it warded off mold. Talk about multitasking. You linger as the family sits down to eat, tearing warm herbed loaves into chunks. For them, this isn't just about freshness. Rosemary and thyme make the bread fragrant, turning a plain meal into something inviting. Bread flavored this way may not last much longer, but it feels special, and sometimes that psychological trick is enough. If you believe your food is preserved, you're less likely to toss it, more likely to stretch it a little further. Step outside, and the night air is full of mingling scents, salted bread cooling on racks, herbed loaves wafting across courtyards, faint smoke curling up into the stars. Rome itself must have smelled like a living pantry, every neighborhood trying its own version of this preservation experiment. And here you realize the brilliance of it all. These were solutions hiding in plain sight. Salt, herbs, smoke, oil, common, everyday things that doubled as preservation hacks. People didn't need advanced science to notice their loaves stayed fresher when touched by these elements. They just had to pay attention and pass down the tricks. One old man passing by chuckles as he sees your interest. He mutters about how in his youth, his mother insisted on sprinkling crushed coriander seeds onto bread because the gods liked it that way. You grin, because historians still argue whether some of these practices were born out of religious ritual or sheer practicality. Was rosemary sprinkled to please Apollo, or simply because it masked the taste of bread one day past its prime? Perhaps both. The more you watch, the clearer it becomes. Romans were as inventive as any modern food scientist, even if their tools were simpler. They used their senses, their traditions, and sometimes sheer superstition to extend the short life of a loaf. You breathe deeply, savoring the smoky rosemary scent, and realize you've crossed from military rations into domestic ingenuity, from bread as survival to bread as artful preservation. But as you continue walking, you notice another sound, a faint clink of ceramic lids, the splash of oil being poured, and the hush of women sealing jars. You turn toward it, curious. If herbs, salt, and smoke could slow staleness, what about the vessels that held the bread itself? Ahead lies a row of clay jars, waiting to trap loaves inside like time capsules. You follow the clinking and splashing into a courtyard shaded by vines, where families are gathered around big-bellied ceramic jars. The air smells of olive oil and beeswax, thick and slightly sweet, and you realize you're about to witness another Roman preservation trick, this one less about flavor, more about containers. Bread may have been fleeting, but the Romans were masters of pottery, and they turned to clay jars as their allies against time. On the ground before you sit rows of dolia, massive storage vessels as tall as your chest, their mouths wide enough to swallow a small child. Inside, families carefully stack loaves, sometimes layering them with cloth or leaves. A woman melts wax in a pan, then brushes it across the rim before pressing down a clay lid. The seal hardens, locking the loaves inside. The idea is simple: keep out air, bugs, and moisture, and the bread stays edible longer. You lean over one jar and catch a faint smell of old wheat, trapped in darkness like a secret. A mainstream fact clicks into your mind: Roman amphorae and jars weren't just for wine and oil, they were the backbone of storage. Archaeologists have found countless examples of sealed containers used for everything from fish sauce to dried fruit. Bread fits neatly into this tradition, though the fragile nature of the loaves means fewer traces remain. Still, the logic is clear. If oil and wine could survive months sealed in clay, why not try the same for bread? Nearby, another family takes a different approach. Instead of wax, they pour a thin layer of olive oil directly over the bread, creating a slippery barrier between loaf and air. It glistens in the torchlight, smelling green and sharp. When the lid drops into place, you realize this is preservation Roman-style kitchen science at its most practical. And here comes your quirky tidbit. One old neighbor swears that stuffing a loaf into a jar with live mice kept mold away. You choke a little, but he insists, claiming the mice ate the bad spirits before they could spoil the bread. Was this ever mainstream? Probably not, but in an age where superstition met desperation, you wouldn't be surprised if some households gave it a shot. Imagine opening your jar for lunch only to find a very fat, very smug mouse. Historians still argue whether sealing bread this way was common or just an occasional trick for the wealthy. Sealing with wax wasn't cheap, after all, and oil was precious. Some scholars suggest it was mostly used for transporting bread over distances, sending loaves to soldiers or relatives far away, while daily households relied more on reheating and flavoring tricks. Others point out the sheer practicality of jars. Once you already had them in your home, why not try storing loaves in them too? You kneel beside one jar, running your fingers over its cool, rough surface. Imagine the suspense of opening it days later, lifting the lid, and praying the bread inside hasn't gone green. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But when it did, it must have felt like magic. A group of children dart past, playing a game with smaller pots, pretending to hide treasure. And in a way, they're not wrong. To a Roman family, a loaf that survived more than 3 or 4 days was treasure indeed. You can't help but notice the parallel to modern packaging. We seal bread in plastic, in foil, in vacuum-packed bags. The Romans had wax, oil, and clay. Different tools, same dream: capture freshness in a bubble, stop time for just a few extra days. As night deepens, you watch a man hoist a sealed jar onto a cart. He's sending it to a relative in another town, trusting that the clay prison will keep the bread edible until it arrives. The donkey brays, the cart rattles away, and you wonder how many of those loaves will actually survive the journey. How many will arrive stale, moldy, or chewed by opportunistic stowaways? You take one last look at the jars, their lids gleaming faintly with wax. Inside them lie loaves suspended in a fragile hope, half science, half superstition. And as you step back into the open street, you hear a different rhythm, the roar of ovens, louder and deeper this time. Not the quiet family hearths, but the booming furnaces of public bakeries, churning out hundreds of loaves at once. And with scale comes a whole new set of problems. How do you keep bread fresh when you're producing enough to feed a neighborhood? You head toward the glow, ready to find out. The glow of firelight grows stronger as you turn a corner and stumble into chaos, rows of massive ovens roaring like beasts, apprentices shouting, and loaves piling up faster than anyone can carry them away. You've arrived at a Roman public bakery, and the sheer scale makes you stop in your tracks. The little household tricks you've just seen, herbs, jars, ceiling, seem almost quaint compared to the industrial urgency unfolding here. Public bakeries were the beating heart of Roman neighborhoods. In cities where apartment dwellers lacked private kitchens, these places fed entire blocks. You watch a crew of flour-dusted men working in rhythm. Some knead dough in troughs, others slide round loaves into cavernous clay ovens, while others haul finished bread out by the armful. Each oven spits out hundreds of loaves daily, and yet you can already see the problem: freshness doesn't last when you're mass-producing. Here's a mainstream fact: Rome boasted hundreds of these large-scale bakeries, especially after the empire centralized grain distribution. The annona, or grain dole, meant subsidized or free bread for citizens. Great for morale, but it also created logistical nightmares. If bread went stale overnight in a small household, imagine what happened to hundreds of loaves sitting in baskets by dawn. You lean closer and see one solution at work: smaller loaves baked in batches so new rounds could cycle out more often. But even then, the pace of city life meant leftovers were inevitable. You notice bakers tossing yesterday's loaves into a side pile, ready to be sold at discount or repurposed. Nothing was wasted if it could still fill a stomach. And here comes a quirky tidbit whispered by an apprentice. Some bakery owners allegedly soaked stale loaves in water, mashed them into dough, and baked them again. The result? Bread that technically counted as fresh but tasted suspiciously chewy. Customers sometimes complained of double-baked loaves, but if you were hungry and broke, you bought them anyway. You can't help but laugh. Rome's very own version of recycling, long before eco-friendly was a buzzword. You watch as customers jostle at the front counter. Housewives clutch baskets, slaves run errands for their masters, and street vendors haggle for bulk deals. The air buzzes with impatience. Bread here isn't leisurely, it's business, politics, survival. Bakers can't fuss over every loaf with rosemary sprigs, they're simply trying to keep up with demand. Historians still argue whether these bakeries deliberately planned their production to match the rhythm of the city or just churned out as much as possible, hoping it would all sell. Some believe surplus bread was intentionally produced to demonstrate abundance, an emperor's silent promise that no one in Rome would go hungry. Others suggest bakers were simply bad at predicting demand, leading to daily piles of stale leftovers. You step around the ovens, heat pressing against your skin like a wall. The workers move in a blur, and you realize freshness here is measured in hours, not days. Loaves are carried directly from oven to counter to customer, with no time to spare. Yet by evening, what doesn't sell becomes tomorrow's problem, and tomorrow's hustle involves finding ways to disguise that staleness. The human side is easy to see. A tired woman buys a loaf for her family, knowing it will be rock hard by morning. She doesn't complain, she'll dunk it in broth tomorrow, fry it in oil, maybe crumble it into porridge. Bread in Rome had second and third lives, and everyone understood the rhythm. But it still gnawed at bakers' pride. What good is mass production if half your loaves end up tasting like stone? The bakery master sighs, wiping sweat from his forehead, and mutters a curse about fickle bread. You get the sense he knows freshness is a battle he'll never win. And yet, every morning, the ovens blaze again, and the cycle continues. You glance at the counters piled high, each loaf stamped with the bakery's mark. Branding wasn't new. Romans loved to advertise. The marks didn't guarantee freshness, but they told you whose oven produced your bread. It's almost funny. Imagine proudly stamping your family name on something you know will be stale in a day. As you step outside, the night is alive with bread baskets heading in all directions. The city is fed, but the clock is ticking, and tomorrow's complaints will start the moment people bite into their day-old loaves. You can almost hear the vendors already scheming how to make yesterday's bread smell like it was baked just now. And with that thought, you catch a whiff of coal smoke and sizzling crust, guiding you toward the street sellers who specialized in culinary illusion. You drift away from the industrial roar of the bakery into narrower streets where the city breathes differently. Here, the hum isn't ovens, but voices, hawkers calling out, frying pans hissing, baskets thudding down on wooden stalls. Welcome to the marketplace, where freshness is half real, half theater, and stale bread is reborn under clever hands. The first stall you pass smells intoxicating: olive oil bubbling in a shallow pan, little cubes of bread sizzling until their edges turn golden. The vendor sprinkles on salt and herbs, tossing them to waiting customers. To you it looks like the ancestor of croutons, but to him, it's a business plan. Yesterday's bread dressed up as today's street food. He grins, holding one out, and you bite into a crunchy, savory cube. You almost forget it was stale just this morning. Here's a mainstream fact: Roman street vendors were masters at reusing leftovers. From fish to porridge to bread, nothing went to waste. Ancient writers complained about the creativity, mocking vendors for disguising food that should have been thrown out. Yet for the working poor, these tricks weren't scandals, they were blessings. As you wander further, you see bread sliced thin and toasted over coals, brushed with garum, the infamous fermented fish sauce. The smell is sharp enough to make you flinch, but customers line up eagerly. Another stall sells bread soaked in wine, then fried in honey, handed out in sticky squares. If you squint, it's suspiciously close to French toast, though you doubt the Romans cared about breakfast aesthetics. They cared about eating every crumb. And here's your quirky tidbit: some vendors even rubbed stale bread with onions or strong cheese before reselling it, claiming the sharp flavors proved freshness. You can't help but chuckle. It's like spraying perfume on a sweaty tunic and calling it clean. Effective in a pinch, but nobody's fooled for long. Historians still argue whether this marketplace theater fooled people or whether everyone was in on the joke. Was the bread really believed to be new, or was it simply accepted that street food was built on yesterday's scraps? Perhaps customers didn't care, as long as it was hot, cheap, and edible. The evidence is murky, and scholars debate whether such practices were tolerated necessities or borderline fraud. You pause at a cart where a man beats stale loaves with a hammer, shattering them into crumbs. He sells them in little packets, advertising their use as thickener for stews or filler for sausages. The hammer bangs rhythmically, like a drumbeat of desperation and resourcefulness. You realize this isn't just about preservation anymore, it's about transforming staleness into something else entirely. A boy nearby chews a hard crust like candy, sucking on it to soften it with saliva. He looks happy enough. And you think, freshness is relative. For him, it's food, plain and simple. For the wealthier households buying herbed loaves and sealed jars, it's a daily irritation, something to outwit with oil and rosemary. For bakers and vendors, it's profit or loss. Same bread, different stakes. You keep moving, and the smells follow you: garum, honey, charred crusts, sizzling oil. They layer over each other until your nose is dizzy. Rome's marketplace is a sensory trick, keeping buyers distracted by heat and flavor so they forget about time's slow theft. It makes you laugh quietly. Today we slap a best by date on plastic bags, and we panic if bread lasts too long, wondering what chemicals made it immortal. Back then, Romans did the opposite. They chased any trick that would stretch their loaves just a little further, happy if it stayed soft one more day. And as the night deepens, you see stalls shutting down. Leftovers are wrapped, salted, dunked in oil, ready for another round tomorrow. Somewhere, another vendor whispers a blessing over his pile of crusts, asking the gods for better luck in the morning. And you, standing at the edge of this noisy market, catch the faint whir of millstones in the distance. It reminds you, bread wasn't just a product. It was a system, one tied to the grinding of grain itself. Maybe, just maybe, controlling the flour meant controlling the freshness too. Drawn by curiosity, you follow the deep rumble of stone against stone, toward the mills where it all began. You follow the low growl of stone on stone until the marketplace noise fades behind you, replaced by the steady, hypnotic grind of mills. The air thickens with flour dust, and your sandals crunch on stray grains scattered across the ground. Here, at the mills, bread doesn't exist yet, it's just the dream of flour, caught between stone wheels. And if you want to understand how the Romans fought against staleness, you have to start here, at the very beginning. In the half-dark of a milling yard, you watch donkeys trudging in endless circles, harnessed to massive basalt wheels. Each slow step pulls one stone across another, crushing wheat into powder. The donkeys blink lazily, dust coating their eyelashes, their lives one long carousel of grain. Men stand nearby with baskets, scooping up the flour and sifting it through woven sieves. The result is uneven, some coarse, some fine, but it's the foundation of every loaf. A mainstream fact comes to mind: Roman mills were technological marvels of their age. Water-powered mills existed too, especially in places like Barbagal in Gaul, where a hillside system could grind enough grain to feed thousands. Yet the donkey-powered mills of Rome were the everyday reality, churning out the flour that would rise into bread across the city. You crouch near a pile of flour, running your fingers through it. It clumps slightly, faintly moist from the humid air. That moisture, you realize, is the enemy already threatening the bread that doesn't even exist yet. Romans knew this too, which is why millers worked fast, trying to keep the flour dry and ready for immediate baking. The fresher the flour, the better the bread, and perhaps the longer it resisted turning stale. And now, the quirky tidbit: some millers supposedly added ground beans or even chalk to stretch their flour. The beans could improve texture slightly, but the chalk? That was just a scam. Customers often suspected it, and satirical poets mocked bakers for selling loaves of stone. You laugh to yourself, imagining someone biting into bread and wondering whether they'd chipped a tooth on a limestone surprise. Historians still argue whether manipulating the flour, sifting it finer, mixing it with additives, storing it longer, truly made bread keep better. Some suggest finer flour staled faster because it lost moisture quickly, while coarser flour retained its bite longer. Others point out that additives might have been less about freshness and more about tricking customers into thinking their bread was whiter, cleaner, more expensive than it really was. Either way, flour was never neutral. It shaped not just flavor, but how long a loaf could survive. You wander through the yard as workers shout and dust rises in little glowing clouds. The rhythm of the mills is endless, almost soothing, stone scraping stone, baskets shifting, donkeys plodding. It's the quiet prelude to all the loudness of bread making. Without this stage, no rosemary, no jars, no fried croutons would exist. And in some way, freshness always began here. One worker lifts a basket and winks at you, whispering that the best flour should always be stolen straight from the mill. Bake it before it rests, and it stays soft, he says, as if letting flour sit too long lets it go stale before it's even baked. Maybe it's superstition, maybe it's observation, but you sense a little kernel of truth hidden inside. You think about how modern kitchens carefully seal flour in bags, dry and sterile. Romans had burlap sacks, clay bins, and hope. Rats darted through storerooms, humidity crept in, mold sprouted if you weren't careful. Bread's shelf life was doomed before it even reached the oven. And still, they fought to get ahead, turning grain into flour, flour into dough, dough into loaves, as quickly as possible. As the donkeys circle, you notice how quiet the city feels here. No shouting vendors, no roaring ovens, just the ancient heartbeat of food preparation. Bread may have been fickle, but its cycle was relentless, beginning every night and morning with this grinding, grinding, grinding. You wipe flour from your face and step back into the night. The smell of grain clings to you, but another aroma drifts in on the breeze, sour, tangy, alive. It's not flour this time, but fermenting dough. Someone nearby is experimenting with leavening, the next frontier in Rome's battle against time. Drawn by curiosity, you follow your nose, leaving the mills behind for the bubbling mysteries of sourdough. The air sharpens as you follow that tangy scent, a sour bite that cuts through the dusty blandness of flour. You come to a workshop where bowls sit lined on benches, dough bubbling and fizzing like it's alive, which, of course, it is. Roman bakers knew the trick of leavening, capturing wild yeast to make bread rise. And this bubbling, breathing starter may have been their most mysterious weapon in the struggle against staleness. You lean close to one of the bowls. The surface trembles faintly, little bubbles bursting with soft sighs. A baker nearby laughs at your fascination and explains that this is their old dough, a lump saved from yesterday's batch, fed with water and flour, left to sour. Tomorrow, it becomes the spark for new loaves. The sourness isn't just flavor, it might have been preservation, too. Here's your mainstream fact. Sourdough-like fermentation was common in the Roman world, long before packaged yeast existed. The natural acids produced by fermentation slowed the growth of mold, meaning sour bread could stay edible a little longer than its bland, unleavened cousin. For a city always fighting staleness, this was more than chemistry, it was survival. You break off a crust from a nearby loaf and taste it. Tangy, chewy, a little earthy. It's denser than the airy bread of today, but you can imagine how Roman mouths delighted in it. The sourness lingers, masking any hint of staleness. For families, this meant one more day before bread had to be fried, soaked, or dunked into stew. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some bakers supposedly named their starters like pets, talking to them, scolding them, even claiming one batch had divine blessing if it produced particularly fine loaves. Imagine praying to your lump of fermenting dough before bed, whispering, "Please don't die tonight, I need you tomorrow." Honestly, if you've ever accidentally killed a sourdough starter in modern times, you get it. Historians still argue whether Roman sourdough was a deliberate preservation strategy or simply a happy accident of taste. Did bakers notice its longer shelf life and cultivate it for that reason? Or were they chasing the flavor and only later realized it fought mold? The debate keeps going, with some pointing to recipes that emphasize sourness, while others suggest preservation was just a lucky side effect. You watch as workers knead huge troughs of dough, mixing in lumps of yesterday's starter, folding it carefully like a ritual. The smell fills the air, sour but warm, alive but comforting. You realize freshness here wasn't just about sealing or herbs, it was about controlling life itself, letting invisible organisms fight on your side against the creeping army of staleness. The baker wipes his hands on his tunic and gestures toward a shelf. There, loaves sit cooling, their crusts darker, their centers puffed. He explains that these sour loaves often lasted 2 days, sometimes even 3, before turning truly inedible. That's practically a miracle in Rome, where soft bread usually stiffened overnight. But don't get too starry-eyed. Some people hated the tang, finding it too sharp. Wealthy Romans often preferred white, delicate loaves, even if they went stale faster. The poor leaned into sourness, it bought them time. And in the marketplace of survival, time was always precious. You sit on a bench as night deepens, listening to the quiet bubbling of bowls. The baker hums a tune, content with his living dough, while outside the city pulses with hunger. You can't help but marvel. A simple lump of old dough, kept alive from day to day, gave Romans one of their best defenses against the ticking clock of bread. As you stand, a faint sweetness cuts through the sourness, drifting from a nearby alley. Honey, thick and golden, being poured over cooling loaves. Another solution, this one sticky, indulgent, and maybe even tastier. You follow the scent, leaving the sour behind for the sweetness of Roman luxury. The sour tang fades behind you, replaced by something richer, heavier, almost intoxicating. The air feels sticky with it, and as you turn a corner you see why: golden honey dripping in slow threads, poured over a tray of fresh loaves. The glow of oil lamps makes the honey shine like liquid sunlight. A baker grins proudly as he brushes the tops, the loaves glistening under his strokes. You step closer, watching the honey seep into every crack, every little bubble in the crust. It's mesmerizing. And instantly you get the logic. If air is the thief of freshness, why not drown the bread in something thick and sweet, sealing it against time? Here's your mainstream fact. Honey was prized in Rome not just for its sweetness but for its preservative qualities. It was used to embalm fruits, to coat cheeses, even to cover meat. Bread, though, was one of its more luxurious uses. Only wealthier families could afford to drizzle honey over entire loaves. It was as much about status as it was about saving food. A baker cuts you a slice. The crust is sticky, your fingers gluey, but the bite is heavenly, soft inside, candle-like outside. The honey clings to your lips, sweet enough to make you forget about staleness altogether. If the loaf had been going stale yesterday, you can't tell now. And for the quirky tidbit, some Romans even buried loaves in jars of honey, letting them soak for days or weeks. The result wasn't really bread anymore, it was more like a chewy cake, dense and preserved, eaten at feasts. You laugh quietly, realizing they'd basically invented an ancient energy bar, the kind you'd pack on a hike, except stickier and without the foil wrapper. Historians still argue whether honey was primarily used for preserving bread or simply for flavor. Was it a deliberate strategy to stretch freshness, or just a decadent treat that happened to extend a loaf's life? In wealthier homes, it may have been indulgence first, preservation second. Among practical households, though, honey could mean the difference between bread lasting a single day or surviving into the next meal. The baker gestures proudly to his honeyed loaves, but then points to another tray nearby, bread smeared with a paste of figs and honey combined. The fruits, mashed and spread thick, create a barrier as well as a sweet explosion of taste. You can almost imagine children licking their fingers clean, never suspecting the paste's secret purpose: to cover dryness with stickiness, to distract the mouth from noticing what time had stolen. You think of modern kitchens with plastic wrap, Tupperware, preservatives. The Romans had clay jars, linen cloths, and honey, messy but effective. You picture a Roman mother tucking away a sticky loaf for tomorrow, knowing her children will eat it without complaint, their mouths too busy with sweetness to protest the chew. As you watch, the baker stores several honeyed loaves in sealed pots, setting them aside for delivery. His apprentice hums happily, licking the spoon. You can't help but smile. There's something comforting about the way honey glues past and present together, giving bread a second life. But as the sticky sweetness fades from your palate, another aroma sneaks in, a sharper, tangier scent, with the unmistakable pungency of vinegar. Not luxurious this time, not golden and glowing, but harsh, practical, almost medicinal. You follow the trail, curious to see how Romans turned this sour liquid into yet another shield against staleness. The honeyed glow fades, and now the night sharpens with a tang that makes your nose wrinkle. Vinegar, pungent, sour, and oddly refreshing in the heat. You find yourself at another bakery corner, where workers dunk loaves into shallow bowls of the stuff, flipping them like sponges. The crackle of crust meeting liquid echoes faintly, followed by the smell of acidity seeping into warm bread. At first it feels strange, why drown bread in vinegar? But then it clicks. That bite, that sourness, isn't just for taste. It's another line of defense, an acidic shield against the creeping invasion of mold and staleness. Here's your mainstream fact. Romans used vinegar constantly, not only in bread but also in sauces, drinks, and preservation. Their beloved drink posca, diluted vinegar with water, was consumed by soldiers and laborers alike. For bread, vinegar worked as both flavor enhancer and mild preservative, keeping loaves edible just a little longer. You take a tentative bite of vinegar-soaked crust. At first it puckers your lips, the sharpness making your jaw tighten, but then the flavor mellows into something almost addictive, bright, sour, cutting through heaviness. You imagine a soldier on the march, tearing at vinegar bread, grimacing at the taste but grateful it hasn't spoiled. Now the quirky tidbit. Some Romans actually stored bread inside vinegar casks, letting it soak deeply until it resembled a chewy sponge more than a loaf. It was then fried or baked again, producing something halfway between bread pudding and pickled toast. Not exactly a five-star dish, but in a world without cling film or preservatives, you take what you can get. Historians still argue whether vinegar treatment was genuinely effective at slowing spoilage or if it simply masked the taste of decay. Did vinegar bread actually last longer, or did people just tolerate it more easily because the sour flavor disguised staleness? Some scholars suggest the acidity genuinely helped, others think it was more psychological, a trick of the tongue rather than true preservation. You watch as loaves are stacked, vinegar glistening on their crusts, dripping onto the ground. Workers joke about their sour sponges, laughing through the sting of the smell. One apprentice dunks a crust too long and eats it dripping, shuddering dramatically until the others clap him on the back. A moment of comedy in the eternal war against stale bread. Your mind wanders to modern vinegar chips, sourdough pretzels, tangy condiments. Perhaps we're not so far removed from these Romans, hiding spoilage under sharp flavors, turning necessity into taste. The difference is, you have a fridge to lean on. They had vinegar jugs. The scent grows sharper as barrels are rolled out, the liquid sloshing inside. Bread, vinegar, soldiers, peasants, it all blends together into one sour story. Yet even here, at the far edge of practicality, the Romans weren't done. They still had tricks waiting in the wings, bigger tricks, in fact. If a single loaf was doomed to go stale too soon, why not bake bread in monstrous sizes, daring time itself to gnaw through bulk before the center turned hard? The idea feels both ridiculous and ingenious, and you can almost hear the laughter of bakers hauling out loaves the size of shields. You follow that thought, leaving the sting of vinegar behind, drawn toward the shadows where colossal ovens still glow, hiding Rome's largest, strangest loaves. The vinegar tang lingers faintly on your tongue, but soon it's replaced by a hushed awe as you step into a cavernous bakery hall. The ovens here are massive, stone mouths glowing with orange fire, big enough for a grown man to crawl inside if he were foolish enough to try. And on the floor, cooling on wooden boards, are loaves so large they seem less like food and more like monuments. Round, heavy, thick-crusted wheels of bread, loaves that could feed a family for days if carefully rationed. You walk slowly among them, amazed at their bulk. Each weighs several kilos, crust as hard as baked clay, centers still steaming hours after leaving the oven. You tap one with your knuckle and it echoes like a drum. Imagine hauling this home after market, you'd need both arms and probably a spare donkey. Here's your mainstream fact. Archaeological finds, especially in Pompeii, have uncovered large loaves marked with scoring lines, sometimes divided into wedges for easy portioning. These loaves weren't snack-sized. They were baked to last, their sheer bulk protecting the inner crumb from drying out too quickly. The bigger the loaf, the longer the heart of it stayed edible. You crouch to examine one, running your hand over the ridges. The crust is so thick it almost looks armored. This was no delicate patrician bread, this was bread as fortification, bread to outlast time. Families would slice the outer layers first, saving the tender middle for later meals, knowing that each layer of crust bought them another day of softness within. For the quirky tidbit, some Roman banquets supposedly displayed loaves so gigantic they bordered on comedic centerpieces larger than shields, paraded for spectacle before being hacked apart. Imagine sitting at dinner while a servant rolls in a bread wheel the size of a cartwheel. Behold, the bread that laughs at staleness. You'd clap politely, then secretly wonder where on earth they stored it. Historians still argue whether these massive loaves were truly a preservation method or simply products of communal baking. Were they meant to keep bread fresher longer, or were they simply practical for feeding crowds, soldiers, slaves, households with dozens of mouths? Some evidence suggests they were strategic for storage. Others think the idea of anti-staleness bread mountains might be more of our imagination than reality. Still, standing among them, you can sense the intention. Scale was its own solution. If time eats from the outside in, why not build loaves so big time gives up before reaching the core? The bakery grows quieter as the fires die down. Workers lean against flour-dusted walls, proud of their day's output, while the enormous loaves cool like slumbering beasts. You can almost hear them sighing in the stillness, the crackle of crust shrinking as steam escapes. Your mind drifts across everything you've seen: honey drizzles, vinegar baths, sour starters, clay jars, reheated street loaves, soldiers gnawing on hardtack. Each trick, each experiment, each flavor an endless Roman dance with time, trying to stretch freshness a little farther. And now, as the embers dim and the city outside sinks into sleep, it's time to let the bread rest and to let yourself drift gently, too. The room is darker now, the glow of the ovens softening to a muted red, like the heartbeat of the earth slowing for the night. You sink into a bench, the warmth around you soothing, the faint scent of flour and crust wrapping you like a blanket. Imagine resting in a world where the hum of daily struggle, freshness, hunger, survival is quiet for a moment. Your breath slows. You picture one of those giant loaves, still warm inside even as the crust hardens, a hidden core of softness waiting patiently. It becomes a gentle metaphor, a reminder that even as days toughen you on the outside, somewhere within, warmth lingers, preserved against time. The laughter of bakers fades, replaced by the softer sounds of a city settling into sleep, distant footsteps, a shutter closing, the whisper of night air moving through alleys. You feel your eyelids grow heavy, the story folding in on itself like dough set to rest. There's no rush now. The battles with staleness, the clever tricks, the debates of historians, let them drift into the background like echoes. What remains is only the quiet assurance that people, across centuries, always searched for ways to hold on to what they cherished, even if only for a day longer. And so, with the ovens cooling and the loaves resting, you too can surrender to rest. Let the crust of wakefulness crack, and sink into the softness within. Sleep takes you gently, like a baker's cloth wrapping warm bread, holding you safe until morning light.